Good day, everyone, and warmly welcome to the Swedish Parliament. My name is Österberg. I'm a member of the Parliament since 2015. And today we are working with the Baha'i international community doing this seminar, together with my colleague Mattias Vepse.
Yeah, hi, nice to meet you. My name is Mattias Vepse. I'm also MP from Social Democrats, living here in Stockholm. And I'm honored to be a part of this seminar. And we are trying to hold this program together for this first 1.5 to 2 hours. Okay, so we are about to start. We have some technical issues before, but now we're up and running. And I would like to start actually, because this is a seminar. It's a co-operation with the Plus 50, the new international conference here in Stockholm, 50 years after the first international environmental conference held here in Stockholm. And I would like to start this day addressing you with the last words that Olof Palme said when he addressed the first climate conference in '72. And he said, "In the field of human environment, there is no individual future, neither for human beings nor for nations. Our future is common. We must share it together. We must shape it together." I think those words up until today is still a road, a map for us, and for the work we have to do when it comes to climate change and how to tackle the climate change. Because we all know that the past 50 years has been a dramatic, we have a dramatic development when it comes to the climate change. We have rising temperatures, we have increasing carbon emissions, and we have a lot to do in front of us. But in the same time, the politicians all over the world has agreed in the Paris Agreement. When here in Stockholm, in Sweden, we have a new climate law. It's almost 4 years old. But around the world, we have new agreements. The new FN agenda, UN agenda for 2030, and we have a lot to do. But we also have within the political system a lot of knowledge what to do. The science is clear, and we want to do more. And I think that's why we're here today, to address those issues and all that we have to do in front of us. And the theme for this seminar is Global Environment Governance, Ethical Foundations, Practical Proposals in an Age of Interdependence. And we have a lot of guests ahead of us, and we're honored to have you here, and we're really look forward to hear what you have to say. And the first guest to have the floor, we're honored, and now we have to see if the technique will work. If we are online, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, global women leader, Voices for Change and Inclusion, statement of the principle framing this moment. You have the floor. The floor is yours. Warmly welcome to Stockholm.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we hear you.
And can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. I am really thrilled to be with you today, even if it's only virtually. Greetings and thank you to the Swedish Parliament, to the Baha'i community, to C4UN, and all the sponsors of this event. That I think it's very important because it marks the beginning of what we hope would be a refoundational moment for the international environmental agenda. And as you mentioned, the title of today's dialogue speaks by itself. We are speaking about the ethical foundations and practical proposals in an age of interdependence. So allow me to start by sharing some initial thoughts of what promises to be a very vibrant and forward-thinking panel. So 3 kickoff ideas, and apologies that for the sake of time, I will use a little bit of a headline style. So number 1, what does the world look like after 50 years after the landmark conference on the human environment? What are the challenges ahead of us, and to close, some reasons for hope? You said it very well. 50 years later, we have more knowledge, better science, more awareness, and a very prolific development of international and domestic environmental law. More than 2,000 environmental international agreements, many foundational documents and outcomes, starting by Our Common Future in '87, the Earth Charter in 2000, the Millennium Development Goals, and today the Sustainable Development Goals. I also think that we do have sufficient evidence to speak about an environmental collapse and understand the urgency to act. Third, we have also witnessed an increasing role of civil society, greater youth engagement in the international environmental scene, and a committed, mostly private sector actors. Yet there is also a collective feeling of anxiety, of fear about the future, of mistrust in politics and institutions. So what are the challenges ahead of us? Number 1, a silo approach to environmental governance and the lack of an overarching framework that considers the Earth system, our life supporting system, our commons in a very fragmented fashion. So we need an overarching normative umbrella, a new pact for the environment. In this case, the divide and conquer algorithm does not work for nature. Number 2, the very concept of governing the commons has had strong reactions from many governments. It is argued that it counters the fundamental principle of national sovereignty, violates Principle 21 of the Stockholm Declaration on the sovereign rights of countries to exploit their own resources in accordance to their own environmental policies. And of course, this is impossible because ecosystems do not respect national borders. And this, of course, calls for the need to rethink the concept of national interest and sovereignty, what it means in these times of global collapse of our life supporting systems. The number 3, production and consumption patterns. We have trespassed planetary boundaries, unlimited growth with limited planetary resources. That's an issue that we need to address seriously. Number 4, the conceptual policy, political narratives and actions that equate development, well-being, and dignity with unlimited growth. So we know that growth does not guarantee equality, fairness, and rights, and on the contrary, it undermines nature's integrity. And number 5, we are using measuring tools for human well-being based on material wealth, on GDP. So we also need to fix the metrics for nature-friendly development. And number 6, something that we cannot ignore, a war that is diverting resources for the responsibility to care, the human security and sustainable development towards weapons, and of course, much needed humanitarian assistance. So these are, in a nutshell, the challenges, but we still have hope and we have co-responsibility. I highly recommend for these the One Planet, One Habitation, excellent document that has inspired this gathering. So just 3 ideas to close. From the conceptual perspective, we need to fix the narrative. This, of course, implies reframing the definitions of wealth, the right of nature to exist and regenerate as part of our own web of life and survival. And we cannot continue to consider nature as a repository of unlimited resources, as an object, but rather as a subject of rights. Number 2, from the institutional perspective, the increasing traction of environmental litigation and enabling legal frameworks such as the right to a healthy environment, the constitutional rights granted to nature, such as the case of my own country, Ecuador. successful climate-related legal decisions in national courts in Germany and other countries. So this is a reason of hope. And from the governance perspective, the need for a multi-scale governance of environmental goods and services, and the critical role of regional and local governments advancing innovative policy and planning. And we have hundreds, thousands of examples from communities, from cities, from countries that should inform global decision-making and vice versa. This should be a conscious and sustained effort to weave among the different scales. Number 4, from the human agency perspective, we cannot afford the luxury of pessimism and inaction. We need to rally behind the power of we, and I repeat, the power of we. Youth, academia, activism, science, civil society, the private sector. Co-responsibility is not only a possibility, but an imperative. I am really looking forward to today's event, which will explore both the principles necessary for this chapter in humanity's existence and also learn about some practical proposals that could be explored to bring these principles into reality. I strongly believe that a new pact for the future requires a value-based multilateral system, a value-based leadership, an intergenerational and feminist environmental leadership leading towards a better politics and better governance. And what I'm saying to close, it's really not an abstract statement. It means to transit from greed to solidarity and redistribution of wealth and power, from prejudice to empathy and kindness, from indifference and hate to radical love for humankind and for nature. Thank you, and very much looking forward to the discussion. Back to you.
Thank you.
I don't have access to Skype, but it's okay. It looks like I do have access to Skype. It's coming to me live.
Okay. But you'll very soon because we need my phone before we have access. Okay, so we will have access to Skype.
No, yeah, I have access.
Wonderful, thank you.
Looking forward to your presentations.
Somewhere. My Swedish isn't good enough to do this on my own. I believe so. Yes, I am. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, dear Maria Fernanda, for those excellent framing remarks, and of course to the ministers of parliament who've so kindly welcomed us into this hall. Prior to offering a few framing remarks, let me just share a few logistical elements. Firstly, this meeting is being streamed on a website, and it's being recorded for future use. So to those of us joining from there, hello. Apologies that this format does not allow for a wonderful interaction, but this is meant to be an ongoing conversation. So take heart that we are always here to continue the conversation. This meeting is also taking place through a Skype platform, which does offer a little bit more of an opportunity for interaction, and I will do my best to monitor the chat there. So if there are questions and comments, I will be in charge of that. After the speakers, we'll have some time for Q&A, and we're looking very much forward to hearing from those in the room if they have contributions they would like to make. And we will have a second roundtable discussion actually around 1 o'clock today, and you are welcome to stick around if you'd like, and if you do not, that is also fine. As we know, you have agency and can do what you need and would like to do. And finally, just to offer once again our really sincere gratitude to the two ministers of parliament serving as our hosts and moderators today, Mr. Anders Österberg and Mr. Matthias Verbsa. So it's a real pleasure to be here in this hallowed hall. And you walked in, you were greeted by Dag Hammarskjöld, who I think is a paragon of international diplomacy, someone to whom those of us who are looking for the coherence between word and deed between our ethical aspirations and our practical application thereof. He's a symbol of that. And in New York, I work a stone's throw away from the Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza, and his name is always spoken of very highly. So it's really quite something to be welcomed with his lovely portrait. And Sweden also, of course, as we're all aware, has the great distinction of having hosted the gathering that gave birth to what became the modern day concept of sustainable development. Yet that birth, of course, was only the beginning, and the concepts of human environment, sustainability, and now the triple planetary crisis are part of an evolving discourse. But just as a child develops in stages, so too must our notions of progress. As understanding deepens, we have to continually refine our methods and our approaches. The coordinating, this is similar to the coordination of an infant. Once they are crawling, they then need to learn to walk. And sure, you need some of those same skills and tools, but they are not sufficient for the next stage in development. And likewise, the tools humanity has used to get to this point have served and continue to serve us. They are necessary, but not sufficient. This is scientific understanding, technological advancement, even some moral and ethical rhetoric, which is all very helpful, but we need more now. And to me, Stockholm Plus 50, this conference for which we have an associated event today, is an opportunity, not for another negotiated text. In a sense, I'm relieved that that's not what is taking place here this week. We have plenty of those. As was mentioned by Maria Fernanda, 2,000 international environment agreements, I think, is enough for us to work from, perhaps too many. It's also not perhaps best for an affirmation of the perilous moment in which we find ourselves. For that has been articulated many times by many individuals the world over, and it's important to recall, but we need again more. Maybe this is an opportunity to deliberate on the next steps. What must advance over the next 50 years equally, if not more so, than what took place over the last half century? And articulating this next gap and proposing ways to bridge it is actually the work of this session. It has also, fortunately, been the work of the Baha'i International Community's United Nations Office for many years. And as part of that ongoing commitment, I have the pleasure, actually, today of making public this statement. There are copies in the back, which is called One Planet, One Habitation, a Baha'i perspective on recasting humanity's relationship with the natural world. The hope is that the perspectives it offers, drawn from efforts in localities around the world, can spark a conversation, generate optimism and consensus, and contribute to the next practical steps we have to take. It focuses on the principles necessary to take us from where we are to where we must go. We have, in a sense, the technical knowledge. Now we need the courage to act. For the change required demands contravening many widely accepted orthodoxies, whether it's the short-term thinking, equating accumulation and acquisition with success, or our fixation on absolute national sovereignty in the face of global threats. Our current course of action is one which is irreconcilable with the well-being of both current and future generations. There are steps which can and must be taken. They've been taken before on numerous occasions, and while the scale of what's required has few corollaries, we can see countless examples around the world of people both demanding and taking action. This should be a source of optimism. So the challenge we're embarking upon was memorably stated by Mr. Gus Speth, the co-founder of the Natural Resources Defense Council, who said in an interview in 2013, "I used to think that top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that." So this morning, let's jump into that breach. What does a cultural and spiritual transformation look like? How can it inspire equally in the common person going about their day, as well as the leaders of government and business whose decisions exert such influence over our world? Let's hope that this document, as well as the wise insights and proposals we hear this morning, can start us down this next path of exploration, which I submit will actually be the defining challenge between now and Stockholm Plus 100. So, honorable ministers, the floor is yours for the next segment. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Very inspiring and engaged to this, and it's also very important. This meeting is now is going on here in Stockholm, and now I want to introduce the next panel. It's Augusto Lopez. We'll talk from Global Governance Forum. We'll talk about practical suggestion linking ethics policy at the global governance. We have Sylvia here, Karlsson, International Environment Forum, and we'll talk about also the same thoughts, perspective of Parliament. We also have Maja Groff in the space. Hopefully, I'm checking at the technicians.
Yes, I'm here.
That's very good. Now we also see you. That's perfect. We'll talk about the same through responsibly change. And Peter Aburi, who will hear and talk about macro reflections on what has been shared. So I leave the floor over to you, Augusto. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for hosting this event, Anders and Matthias. I want to begin by congratulating the Baha'i international community on the preparation of this fine statement. I read it with pleasure. I think it's very insightful. It has a lot of very constructive suggestions and proposals. What I thought I would do today, under the general heading of this session, which is ethical foundations and practical proposals in an age of interdependence, is to divide my remarks in two parts. First, I want to say a little bit about sort of the role of public policies in helping us deal or mitigate the problem of climate change. And then I have some practical proposals in the spirit of the title of this session. In the very beginning of the statement, there is a sentence which I want to share with you, which I think it's a very effective way of framing our current predicament when it comes to what is happening on the environment. The statement says, the question before the nations and leaders of the world is whether the needed action will be taken as a matter of conscious choice and prevention, or whether it will be prompted by the destruction and suffering brought by escalating environmental breakdown. I think it's actually a very effective way to present, the current dilemma that we face collectively, whether we are heads of government, whether we are members of civil society, the business community, the broader society. And in this respect, I'd like to say two or three things. First of all, it seems to me that we are not hampered by the lack of knowledge of what to do about climate change. That is not the challenge or the constraint that we face. I was thinking, sort of reviewing our last 1,000 years of history, trying to come up with an example of a situation in which humanity was facing some kind of huge calamity, and we were in fact hampered by the lack of knowledge, right? Unlike climate change today, all right? And I came up with the following example. I could have come up with other examples as well, but let's see if you agree. Between the years 1346 and 1357, roughly an 11-year period, we suffered the Black Plague. And there were somewhere between 100 and 200 million fatalities. And when you actually look at how did people react against this calamity, how did they interpret, right? Because they didn't know where this was coming from. And the two sort of favorite theories prevailing then at that time to explain this phenomena was that in 1345, the year before the plague, there had been a conjunction of 3 planets. And that was somehow perceived as being the causal factor for the Black Plague. The other prevalent theory was basically this is an act of God, it is punishment for our sins, which didn't help very much if you think about it in terms of how to deal with the crisis, right? Come back to the present, and it was actually in this city, in 1896 that a distinguished Swedish chemist that a few years later would actually win the Nobel Prize in chemistry, that established for the first time the connection between a rise in carbon dioxide on the one hand and rise in average temperature on the other. And I don't know whether you have seen the formula that actually establishes this connection. It's very elegant. Not quite E equals mc squared, but I think it's a very beautiful formula. And actually, Arrhenius, his main worry and the calculations that he made, for instance, established that if carbon dioxide concentration drops by 50%, this would lead to a cooling of the planet of somewhere between 4 and 5 degrees. In other words, his main concern at that time, ironically, was a cooling of the planet, right? That, you know, Sweden would become colder and less hospitable for agricultural production and so on and so forth, right? So we have known this for 100 years. We know where climate change is coming from. And this, of course, has led to the solutions that we have on the table and that have had on the table for decades and decades before us. So what is lacking, if it is not knowledge, then is the following. I think it is that we have a flawed institutional framework for cooperation to address a problem which does not recognize international borders. And this is actually true not just for climate change, it is true for many other problems. We have global problems which require global solutions, and we don't have the institutions to deliver this. And the other sort of problem, it seems to me, is that lack of a political will, and that was captured very nicely by the quote that Dan shared with us towards the end of his remarks about selfishness and lack of imagination. Share with you some practical solutions in the spirit of you know, us living in this age of interdependence. It seems to me that one of the problems is that we need to rethink our economic system, you know, the basic assumptions of our economic system. I think that instead of thinking how to add to the physical dimension of the economic system, we need to think more in terms of the long-term welfare of the community whose interests the economic system is supposed to serve. This is a very important distinction, especially in light of what we have learned in the last many decades about the impact of climate change, which is going to be especially dire in the developing world, in countries that are already under pressure as a result of poverty, malnutrition, and many other problems, right? And obviously, we need to look at this distinction between the scale of the economic system and the long-term worth of the community in a way that also rethinks the ways in which we go about measuring economic success, which, as we know, are very flawed, and they need to be linked much more closely with notions of human welfare. There is a lot of discussion these days about economic growth, and there is broad segments of society, especially civil society organizations, you know, who see economic growth as very much an agent of environmental degradation, destruction, and as fueling, you know, climate change. It seems to me that we need to have a somewhat more nuanced attitude towards economic growth. Economic growth in the last, let's say, the post-war period, the last 70 years, has been the main engine for the reduction of extreme poverty, reduction of illiteracy, infant mortality, and so on. So it has played a very important role. For me, the issue is, yes, let's have economic growth, but let's make sure that this economic growth and the policies that support it are consistent with environmental protection. Right? I think you will agree with me that it makes no sense to destroy our non-renewable resources, to have economic growth for a decade or two, and then all of a sudden to enter into a period of decay and poverty because we have exhausted our resources, right? So obviously it has to be done in a sustainable way. And as Dan, I think, said, the concept of sustainable economic growth or sustainable development is very much a Nordic idea, which has been adopted by the rest of the international community. We want to have economic growth, but it has to be consistent with respect for human rights. I hope you will agree with me that we shouldn't have economic growth by imprisoning minority groups in training camps and giving them zero wages so that they will improve the competitiveness of the country, right? I think we are all agreed to that. We want to have economic growth that is consistent with gender equality. There is no point in subjugating and oppressing half of the population in the interest of economic growth, right? So gender equality is very much at the center of that. We want to have economic growth that is consistent with a narrowing of income disparities, with good governance, respect for the rule of law, transparency, low levels of corruption. I think you begin to get the idea. In fact, this was captured in a very eloquent, very nice way by the head of the Baha'i community in the 1930s when he said that our economic system, I quote, has to safeguard the interests of humanity as a whole and not humanity to be crucified for the preservation of the integrity of any particular law or doctrine or economic system. Right? We're coming out of a 2 to 3 year period when the global economy has been subject to two terrible shocks: COVID-19 and all the ramifications of that, and then, of course, more recently, the war in the Ukraine, which is going to have fairly dramatic implications for poverty, for malnutrition. We don't have the time for me to share with you all the statistics, although I'm happy to do that perhaps later on, right? So what does this imply? To me, it implies the need to rethink our concept of national security. We're coming out of many decades where national security has been perceived as being essentially a military concept. National security is about defending our borders against real or imaginary enemies. It's about having armies that are ready to come to the defense of the population in the case of some adversary, right? And there is a role for this vision of national security. The war in the Ukraine very much makes that clear, right? But it's not enough. It's not sufficient. We need to have a broader definition of security, which is framed in human welfare terms. Let me make my case by posing the following. In 2020, 2021, in the middle of the pandemic, there were something like 1 million fatalities in the United States. More people have died in the United States as a result of COVID-19 than World War I, World War II, the Korea War, the Vietnam War, for the biggest calamities of the past 100 years, right? My point here is that you can have the most sophisticated fighter aircraft, you can have nuclear weapons, and they are totally useless at a moment when the problem that is affecting our welfare and our security is an airborne virus against which we have no immunity, right? So what I would argue is that we need to think of security in terms of human welfare, and that means that maybe we should strengthen our public health systems. Maybe we should have the resources to train our young people so that they will have the skills and the knowledge to operate in an increasingly complex global economy and so on. Let me conclude by just a couple of minutes putting my economist's hat and saying a couple of things. Over the next 10 years or so, we're going to have to spend, somewhere between $75 and $90 trillion to build up low carbon resilient infrastructures, to improve energy efficiency, to invest in renewable energy. And we need to do this to adapt to climate change, and we need to do this also to preserve the development gains of the last 50, 70 years, which are under threat, initially because of COVID, and now because of the war in the Ukraine, and all this will imply for poverty, for famines, for malnutrition, and so on. And this is a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge because we're coming out of a decade where we have spent our way out of the last crisis, which was the global financial crisis, and so public resources are under huge pressure, and they will continue to be under huge pressure because of population aging and so on. And to make matters worse, we're not doing enough to adopt mitigation strategies. Carbon pricing, for instance, remains a problem. It's the most effective weapon that we can use to mitigate climate change, and we're not doing enough of it. All right. We need to phase out energy subsidies. We need to raise more revenues. A very famous economist, James Tobin, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, more than actually about 50 years ago, he came up with a proposal to introduce a tax on financial transactions to raise revenue so that we can finance this transition to a renewable energy economy and so on. We need to improve the efficiency of the tax system. There are too many leakages linked to corruption, to tax havens, and so on and so forth. These are all huge challenges. They are the kind of public policies that are implicit in the statement from the Baha'i international community. To conclude, so what is the choice that we face? To remind you of what I read from the statement, it's conscious, responsible choices on the one hand, or untold human suffering on the other. Right? That is what is before us. And needless to say, my hope is that we will choose the first path, the path of cooperation, the path of respect for human life. And that if we do this, we will start a new stage in our evolution, one in which we will be able to redirect our considerable efforts and our very substantial resources towards the development of our latent capacities as a human family, and towards launching a new stage in the development of human civilization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Augusto. I never seen a parliamentarian write so much as Matthias did during your speech. So incredibly good. Was actually the last time when Augusto was here in the parliament, another MP came to me and said, "Have you heard what Augusto Lopez said in the parliament?" I said, "Yes, I was there. You weren't." So we will see if then it will happen this time as well. So thank you so much. And now I leave the floor to Sylvia, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, honored members of the Swedish Parliament, and citizens of the world wherever you reside. Now, we are here in the building of the Swedish Parliament, and as in other countries, one of the main tasks of this institution is to make laws. The executive and judiciary branches of the government then should ensure that these laws are complied with and enforced, and of course, also to hold actors to account who break those laws. Now, I want to ask you to use your imagination for a couple of minutes. Imagine that here in the Swedish Riksdag, you would need to adopt laws with consensus among every single member of the parliament. One single parliamentarian, let's say from my birth city, Uppsala, can veto any proposed law if he or she doesn't like it, or if he or she doesn't like a paragraph in it. And then imagine that any part of Sweden could refuse to accept a law adopted in this building as applying to them. No, that law, not us. On top of this, imagine there was no police force to monitor compliance with the laws. There were no courts to convict those who break the laws. What would be the conditions for establishing a rule of law in Sweden then? How could you build justice? And yet this is the situation that we have in the world today for international law, including international environment law. And why is this so? Well, because our international system is built on this principle of national sovereignty, of absolute national sovereignty, where any state can veto an international law or choose to simply stay out of it. And this means that the adopted treaties that we have in multitude they are weaker than they need to be. And particularly, they do not include those mechanisms of accountability with tangible consequences for states who do not comply with the laws, because there are always countries who oppose these provisions. Now, we are for very good reasons concerned about violations of national sovereignty through military force. Obviously, we do not accept one state simply invading another, but in an era of global interdependence, the old idea of absolute national sovereignty, the idea that a government of one country has exclusive authority over what happens within its territory, is simply an illusion in many dimensions. The decisions made in this building, for example, in the Swedish Parliament, it has impacts on people, lives and life far beyond the borders of this country. Do the low-lying islands in the Pacific have any real territorial sovereignty when the sea level is rising? Or can the countries facing famine when food prices escalating really claim to have any sovereignty over what happens in their land? Now, so if we accept the physical truth of interdependence, interdependence between the interconnected parts of our planet, and if we accept the ethical principle of being one human family living in one common homeland, then this has big implications for how we take decisions and what decisions we take, both in national parliaments and in the United Nations. And I will discuss two examples of these implications and propose some practical ideas focused on parliaments, actually. So the first implication of accepting both interdependence and the ethical principle of being one human family is that the interests that legislators have for their eyes when making laws and adopting policies has to be expanded. Now, in simple terms, we expect in today's democratic systems that members of national parliaments represent the interests of those who vote for them. That is their job. In similar terms, we expect states to represent their own interests when they negotiate international laws or other policies at the UN. No one has the task to consider the interests beyond those of states, the interests of the common good of all, the interests of future generations, and the natural world. Now, in the ongoing reform discussions in the UN about how to make multilateralism more effective for protecting the planet and for other aspects, there are proposals seeking to address somewhat this gap. For example, a proposal to establish a UN special envoy for future generations and giving the Trusteeship Council trusteeship over the global commons and global public goods. But of course, the proposals on the table do not really give these institutions any real authority, only an advisory role. Anything else would, of course, be pushed aside at the moment. But the direction is important. And the idea of the concept of trusteeship is something that we should take seriously. So my specific proposal here is that parliaments need to embrace the concept of trusteeship before the UN can properly apply it. Applying this principle would enable parliaments to learn what it means to adopt national laws based on ethical principles in an age of interdependence. And one way of doing this could be to establish a trusteeship committee in a parliament. The task of this committee would be to analyze the implications of legal proposals and other policies for non-citizens. And this can include implications for human rights globally, for the global commons, and for future generations globally. The committee then would have the mandate to communicate their outcomes clearly to the parliament, who in turn should provide some kind of response. And in its work, the committee can of course consult whoever they see fit in order to have fact-based and ethically grounded conclusions. Now, such a committee has a challenging task that requires very specific capabilities from its members. So I would propose the members should ideally be globally oriented, principled, possess the highest integrity, and perhaps most of all, be more attached to truth than power. If the messages of this committee become unpopular, its members may not be elected again. Remember that they should not consider the interests of their voters. And considering these specific characteristics, I suggest its members need to be elected not according to party lines and with candidates electioneering and selling themselves to be part of this committee, but rather in quiet and dignified elections among all parliamentarians, free from party lines and only considering personal characteristics. Okay, now I move to my other example. If we accept the physical truth of interdependence between the interconnected parts of our planet, and if we accept the ethical principle of one human family, whose common habitation this one earth is, then this also has implications for how we look at the rule of international law. Now, I started my reflections with a rather blunt picture of how weak international law is today. I did that to make sure we are aware of the baseline where we are. I did not say that international law has no meaning or no impact. That was absolutely not my intention. The making of many international environmental laws with obligations for countries in relation to a wide scope of environmental concerns is truly evidence of the ability of countries to come together around common issues of common concern. And similarly, the ability to adopt a set of global goals and action plans accompanying them, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, show the same ability. But both laws and goals have led to many actions around the world, many positive actions. What is now needed, as was referred to earlier, and what is the focus of Stockholm Plus 50, is to turn those words into much, much more action. We know implementation is variable at best, and very few global goals have been achieved. Now, the UN Secretary General highlighted the rule of law at all levels as one of the themes in our common agenda, his proposals for reform for effective multilateralism. And he highlighted this as it being crucial for increasing the effectiveness of multilateralism. But again, my proposal here is that parliaments should take the lead. They can provide the foundation for stronger rule of international environmental law and thereby global environmental governance. Parliaments already have the formal role of holding their government to account for its actions. And this, of course, includes whether the government does what is necessary to achieve the objectives of adopted policies and laws. What parliaments can do a lot by sharpening their attention on how their respective government fulfills its legal obligations under various international environmental treaties, and the moral obligations under action plans, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this close scrutiny would be valuable at different stages. At the stage of negotiating a treaty to make sure it's ambitious, at the stage of ratification when an international treaty is turned into national law, but most importantly, at regular moments linked to domestic or international policy cycles. At these moments, parliaments can engage in a form of national self-accountability process. The parliament can hold up a mirror, look at itself, and ask critical questions about whether their country is doing enough, is doing their fair share, are they doing the highest possible contribution they can do towards the achievement of a global goal or towards complying with their obligations. Most international legal obligations are procedural, with countries themselves filling in the content of how much they should do. How much climate mitigation should they do under the Paris Agreement is up to every country. How much nature protection under the Convention on Biological Diversity is up to every country. And how much do you do towards the SDGs, domestically and international? It's up to every country. And these are the kind of value-laden questions over which a parliament needs to engage in deep deliberation, preferably engaging many layers of society in the process. But for this to happen, there needs to be enough parliamentarians who care deeply about the rule of international law and the outcomes they serve. And as closing words, I want to say that learning to live in an age of interdependence is hard. Accepting that we need to find new principles for how we care for each other and new institutional structures to enable these. Now, the proposals I've offered here are also hard, but they do allow for experimentation and learning over time in a national context, so that countries may one day dare to apply them in global governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A lot to sink in, especially for us as parliamentarians. And with that, I would try to see if we can find Maja in the space.
Hello, yes.
There we are. Warmly welcome. Please, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be with you, sharing with you today some perspectives on the Global Climate Governance Commission and its ongoing work. And I'll focus in the second part of my remarks on one specific project on responsibility chains, very apropos to our theme today. So we come together at the moment, at a moment of great hope, I hope, and commemoration on the occasion of Stockholm Plus 50. But as other speakers have also underlined, it's also a time of great challenges for the international community, a time indeed of crisis. In our Common Agenda report, the UN Secretary General describes our current shared planetary predicament as the greatest challenge since the Second World War. He notes, I quote, "We are at an inflection point in history. Humanity faces a stark and urgent choice, a breakdown or a breakthrough. The disastrous effects of a changing climate threaten our very existence." And then second main point he makes in this paragraph, which I think is very relevant today, he says, humanity's welfare and indeed humanity's very future depend on solidarity and working together as a global family to achieve common goals. So our very future depends on our solidarity and working together. And he even uses this language as a global family, echoing some of the speakers already about really how can we conceptualize our unity as humanity, a human family. how can we really intensify our global solidarity to rise to the current challenges? So we at the Climate Governance Commission feel strongly that our shared global governance represents the key kind of frameworks for global solidarity and cooperation. And we feel the innovative new perspectives for global governance to deploy also new levels of our collective wisdom, our collective ingenuity from all parts of the world. These new levels of imagination, solidarity will be required to tackle current existential planetary risks. So the Climate Governance Commission seeks to be pioneering in this respect, aiming to fill a crucial gap we see in the policy discourses in confronting the global climate emergency, to develop, propose, and build partnerships to promote feasible and high impact global governance solutions, looking from the planetary level at the whole of the ecological system, whole of the global governance system, in order that we might take urgent and effective climate action to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade or less. And we know that this is now a very, very tall task if we are to keep temperatures, global temperatures at 1.5 degrees centigrade. We are very rapidly running out of global carbon space to have any chance of keeping the planet within a climate system maintained well below 2 degrees Celsius, as noted, as you know, the higher goal or the less ambitious goal in the Paris Agreement. And according to recent IPCC reports, we have reached the warmest temperature on Earth in the last 100,000 years. And we are experiencing more severe effects much earlier than scientists have expected. And even more worrying, we're told by scientists that risks of irreversible changes and tipping points can no longer be excluded in our climate system. So we are indeed at a moment of crisis, of emergency, and the UN Secretary General has asked all countries to declare a state of climate emergency. And as noted by earlier speakers, Fernanda and Sylvia, we have a very weak international rule of law, and 50 years of global governance efforts for climate and ecological safety have so far really not generated the required transformations that we need to see in our societies. We need new ideas, new approaches. Sylvia has suggested a very innovative, interesting idea. The Climate Governance Commission, for your information, released an interim report last autumn, just before COP26, and we shared a range of global governance innovation proposals across various thematic areas that are implicated, for better or for worse, in the climate challenge. For example, the mobilization of sufficient levels of global finance, much higher than we're currently even committed to. And Augusto wrote that paper. I think it might be very interesting for you to have a look. Also, we have a work on facilitating the necessary labor market transitions at scale, notions of climate and security, international legal accountability, international institutional reform, among others. So many of these individual global governance innovation proposals highlighted in the interim report, if implemented, even one of them could have a transformative effect on the global climate action landscape. So as an international community, we have many options, but many of these options to be implemented at scale do indeed require closer international cooperation, a new attitude, a new perspective. So in the time I have left, I would just like to share with you one of the newer proposals that we are currently supporting for the development of a global multi-stakeholder responsibility chains task force, which would develop a new approach to key international commodity chains most responsible for global forest destruction. And the Responsibility Chains project is led by our partner organization based in Brazil, the Global South, Plataforma CIPO. And we think that this proposal, among others, is very emblematic of the kind of innovative thinking that we need, and also this new international ethic that we also need, one of strengthened global solidarity, close cooperation, and also responsibility of all actors, that we weave together webs of responsibility of all stakeholders in society to work together towards very ambitious goals. So the project responds to a pressing need. There is currently no global treaty for forests, and there is no prospect immediately for such a binding multilateral treaty to be developed. And at the same time, in forested areas, illegal deforestation and degradation has become a vital planetary issue. Forests help to stabilize the global climate, regulate ecosystems, play a role in the carbon cycle, and are home to 80% of the planet's terrestrial biodiversity. And moreover, in terms of human dimension, globally, about 1.6 billion people, almost 25% of the world's population, rely on forests for their livelihoods, many of whom are in the world's poorest countries. So we do need, as soon as possible, and this is the same in many areas of international problems, as Augusto was alluding to, we need global perspectives, we need global cooperation to protect forests and stop this widespread environmental destruction, addressing both the climate and biodiversity crises, as well as the related human rights abuses, labor violations associated with the predatory use of forest resources. So Plataforma CIPO, together with the Climate Governance Commission, is creating a responsibility chains task force to create an action plan for a multi-stakeholder platform to convene actors, initiatives, coordinate efforts, and then to have an umbrella framework around this concept of responsibility chains, with the goal of zeroing illegal deforestation by 2030, which is the goal set out in the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use at COP26. So just a moment on this notion of responsibility chains, it refers to far more than supply chains, sort of reductionistic and purely corporate or instrumental economic perspective. Rather, this concept that is being pioneered by Plataforma CIPO refers to the interconnected sets of socio-environmental relations that link commodity producers to consumers, from the source of finance and primary production to extraction and manufacturing, exporting and importing, all the way to the final consumption and to consumers that we know in so many countries care passionately about climate and global ecological issues and very much want to do their part in as much as they can. So the concept of responsibility chains acknowledges the roles of multiple actors and thus demands accountability from all, responsibility of all along, the parts of a supply chain, from a state, producers, importers, private sector, financing, consumer groups. And responsibility chains also entail international cooperation among producer-consumer countries, bridging north-south divides that have often blocked international cooperation around forest issues, around other issues related to climate and environment. How do we bridge these north-south divides and build reconciliation, cooperation, healing even among these global divisions? So that is the project in the nutshell, and I very much welcome any interest in this project or other work of the Climate Governance Commission. Please do reach out. We're looking for state and national actors of all description, and we very much hope to launch this project in the next 6 months. So just to conclude, we very much hope that going forward, international projects and ideas like that of responsibility chains will flourish and take life, and indeed inspire others to think and act in different ways, acknowledging our very deep interdependence and the webs of international relationships that already do exist, and then also vitally our responsibilities to each other around the world and our capacities to think in creative and innovative ways, to collaborate, and to really have the capacity and find the ways to solve the very difficult planetary issues of our time. I'll end there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Maja. And now it is the biggest mission here to summarize what we have learned and what to do with it. So go ahead, Peter.
Thank you so much. And my name is Peter Aburi, and I'm representing the Baha'i international community. So my task is quite tedious because I have to pick on everybody's practical contributions and summarize it. But I wanted to go back on my notes because I've been busy trying to put everything together. And one particular quote that struck me when we started was from a Member of Parliament, Maja, when he said that, I rephrase from the quote of 1972, that the future, we must share it together, we must shape it together. And that future is actually now. It's not like something that is going to come. It's right here with us. And I think clearly the science is there, and the capacity and the knowledge sharing mechanisms are there. And of course, the international agreements are there. The discourses, are evolving and have been evolving from time. So it is time to act, and we do not have a way to delay or to wait and keep pushing it, keep rethinking it. Of course, the rethinking is also to understand that our capacity has also been growing over the years, since our advancement of science and technology is also coupled with what has been happening, and also the policy frameworks. And I like what you all were sharing around, we have this, lack the political will, and also what Sylvia was sharing is around the international systems is built only on the principle of national sovereignty, that what, for example, the members of parliament, honorable members here, they will make, policies that protect only Sweden, but they do not know that those policies they pass have an impact, for example, for Kenya, or for Vanuatu, or for the countries in the Caribbean. So how is it then that we can go beyond making policies that cover or encompasses the whole planet as one homeland, rather than thinking in what Maria was saying, that we think, of course, in silos. The silos approach is not going to work anymore. What we would like is think beyond our national sovereignty or our national borders, because what you could see today, and of course Augusto was sharing about the pandemics, COVID-19 was a clear example that we were all cornered, we were all locked down. And then the war that is ongoing, you could see how that is also affected life in different parts of the world. And I can share that, for example, in Kenya, where I come from, the prices of commodities have tripled. And I would also assume that, where you all come from in different parts of the world, you've seen quite a skyrocketing situation that is unsustainable. And also this is also making us rethink, is it the war that is, war is not good, first, we all agree. But then it's the systems of our own production and consumption, are they sustainable enough to be able to keep us through, let's say, status quo, there was no war. So those patterns of unsustainable production and consumption that, as all the speakers have shared, they are not going to keep us going the way we are. So the pandemic is giving us a rethinking of what we have been doing. And the war is also, as sad as it is also telling us we have also to rethink. And as also Augusto saying, rethink our economic systems. It is not, going to be the same way that we have had it. Rethink of the human rights and gender equality. And also thinking of the income, disparities between dichotomize the world into two developed and developing world. Sometimes we talk of the South and the North and South-South. All these kind of different dichotomies we've created, but in the whole creation, you realize that it is not all that. And I think if I were to, share also another, small example, another statistic that I've come across. If you look at the carbon emission of someone who lives in Africa, or I would say in particular in Kenya, there was a comparison that the carbon emission of a person who lives in Kenya is 0.3 versus, say, a person who lives in Sweden, which is 4.6. So it already tells you that we are living in the world that in one part we are, our way of life is not sustainable. And maybe how do we also try to use the science and translate that knowledge to the ones that are now, say, catching up or learning and growing, to be able to keep it as low, not to escalate it, because now when we escalate it, we are talking of trying to keep the temperatures at 1.5. If we go beyond 1.5, then it is very complicated. And also, how do we translate this knowledge to, for example, we talk of mitigation, adaptation. Do those terms resonate with the local community? What does, for example, my grandma understand about what is mitigation, So if you talk to, for example, if I was to say of agriculture, if you talk to my grandma, when she was, growing up and doing, farming, they used to crop rotate, and they would grow a certain crop this season, and next season they will not grow the same. So, and this conversation has also evolved. In today's, with scientific terms, you think of that as regenerative agriculture, where it is a formula of actually fixing the nitrogen in the soil, you see. So it goes beyond what, for example, for them, they did not understand all these very, scientific terms and ways of doing things, but they did practical, things that kept them going, and they had the yield that they wanted or they needed to keep sustaining them. So I think, in a nutshell, you would see also proposals around the renewable energy, the thinking, how do we hold ourselves accountable? Accountability mechanisms, as Sylvia was also sharing, is that do really members of, of institutions, or the policy makers, the civil society, the private sector, hold themselves accountable each day on the actions they are taking to serve the common good? Or is it that, for example, the members of parliament, together with us, are they only serving their constituents who have elected them? And if something were to go wrong, then they know that their seat is threatened because they keep serving just a small group of constituents rather than serving the common good. And I think the call is that let's all see that the common good is better than the individual constituents or a small group of constituents that we're all serving. So I think, and also that, aspect of what Augusto was sharing about the conscious, responsible choices. We cooperate, we go beyond our small group, we go beyond the profit, we go beyond just measuring the wealth of the world in GDP terms. It doesn't make sense, for example, for some people in the local context, they don't even understand what is GDP, but life is good for them. They do their own agriculture, they do their own small trade here and there, and life and the impact to the environment, sometimes when you measure it, is so little. But sometimes because big corporations, nationals, we want to amass, wealth, we want to create more, and we want to accumulate because of greed and selfish, then we keep pushing, The growth is like, this year we did not meet our targets. How are we pushing more to get, to the next level, So I think, in summary, you would see a diverse, thoughts, but key things is that, framework, the policy framework, the political will, and also rethinking these economic measuring formulas, and also trying to rethink our impact in terms of, renewable energy, regenerative agriculture, and also what Maja was saying, think creatively to how do we address these challenges. And I think sometimes also we have so many good things, as Sylvia was saying, there are so many good things that are also happening. It's not all like we have to be very sad. Yes, it is sad, but also sometimes we have to lighten up and say, we are doing it and we are acting, and we're acting now. And I think I like one sentence from the statements that is being launched, is that the task of building a sustainable and flourishing world holds the promise of providing a point of unity, not only in shared endeavor, but in joyful celebration as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we too, mostly me, are going to attack the panel. Just in, you can call it a quiz. In all our constituencies, 1994, we said that we are going to level up the taxes, higher the taxes. We are going to cutting down the social welfare. We are going to fire some thousands of teachers in the country, or some thousand nurses we are going to fire, and we are also going to cut in the social welfare. How much percent do you think that we got an election, Peter?
None.
Sylvia?
None.
I'll be bold and say 5%.
No, we said it was for a common good, and we got 45.9%. So it's also just a reflection. It's also about leadership. If it's also now have this discussion about Russia and their invasion about Ukraine. And before the war, it was like 70-80% against NATO membership. And then the politicians here in Sweden said, rely on us, this is for common good in Sweden. And now the opinion also, sometimes it's also about leadership, to dare. But I also know that Matthias now has a lot of questions, so we are going to share. He will have some questions, and then we'll also allow everyone else to have some questions. But Matthias, please start.
Okay, thank you. But first, Dan, is someone having questions online, or
no? We see them.
Okay.
I haven't seen any yet, but those who have joined on Skype, you're most welcome to put a question in the chat box, and we will do our best to address it as well.
Yeah, thank you. I was writing down some thoughts from each of you, and it was very, very interesting. So, but I think one question that is rising in my head is, how can we manage to lowering the gap, or we say, between what we know and what we have to do? Because everyone is saying that we know what to do, the science is clear, we have 2,000 agreements in place in order, and in the same time, we know that the emissions are keeping rising. So what can we do within the framework of democracy to make people vote for politicians, put pressures on politicians that make us be able to handle this question? Yeah, Augusto.
We have a framework, which are the goals agreed in the Paris 2015 agreement, right? At least there was a recognition that we have a serious problem before us. We need to do something about it, right? But what's embedded in the agreement obviously is highly inadequate. The goals are voluntary. There are no penalties for failure to fulfill the goals and so on. However, there is a clause in the agreement which anticipates going back periodically to those goals with the intention of revising them so as to make them consistent with the 1.5 degrees target, right? To me, that suggests the possibility of some solution. In other words, as the impact of climate change becomes evident, as we see more and more extreme weather events, we see environmental devastation, we see crop failures, and so on and so forth. My hope is that the leaders who will get together from time to time to revise the targets of the Paris Agreement will at some point basically say to themselves, look, this is not working, right? It's one thing to have laudable goals, it's something else to have an operational mechanism that actually delivers those objectives, right? that to me is the solution. And you know, I think many of us have referred to the issue of political will, right? That at some point, I think that nation states that get together in Paris or wherever, right, they need to realize that we need to go beyond just simply protecting national interests. We need to think in terms of global consequences, because nobody will be exempt from the consequences of climate change. So I go back to the quote that Dan shared with us at the very beginning, where he said that I used to think that the problem of climate change was carbon pricing and so on and so forth. I don't remember exactly, but in the end he said, no, the problem really is, what was it?
Greed and apathy. Selfishness, greed, and apathy.
Right, right. I think that's the gap that we need to bridge, right? It's not a knowledge gap. It's a gap of basically solidarity. It's a gap of awareness of the calamities that are coming our way. It is a recognition that there is untold human suffering before us unless we do something, right? And that requires leadership.
Just a question about solidarity, if you could continue, Augusto, because now we are sending weapons to Ukraine. Most of the Western world is supporting Ukraine in tremendous different ways. But why is that so easy? And we think that is good, of course, but why is that so easy and it's so hard about the climate?
About the Ukraine crisis is that now you see more and more people, and this is really worrying, more and more people seeing that there is a kind of a trade-off between what they call energy security, means availability of energy at good prices and so on the one hand, and on the other hand, you know, climate change mitigation and dealing with the environment, right? And to me, this is a false dichotomy, you know. If we're going to say, oh, no, we need to have cheap energy and we need to have, you know, we need to replace the supplies from Russia and we need to, you know, just think more about energy security, therefore we can afford to put off for the next, whatever, 5 years, however long the Ukraine crisis lasts, you know, issues of climate change, carbon pricing, et cetera, I think we're going to end up paying a higher price in the future. Right? So I think that is a source of worry to me, that I see the increasing tendency to relax the urgency of climate change because of the crisis in the Ukraine.
Yes, we will give both Maja and Sylvia a possibility to have a short response. So Sylvia, will you start?
Okay, sorry, I need to run off to the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm very sorry. Sylvia, do you mind?
Yeah, that's okay.
Sorry, I have an important meeting. I need to get, I have my coat on already. Just two really quick practical points in terms of potential collaboration, also in terms of this incredibly important question about engaging democracies and indeed citizens all over the world, and also to accelerate what we know needs to be done and to accelerate achievement of the Paris Agreement goals, which the goals are absolutely clear and worthwhile. So firstly, I'm speaking now with the Club de Madrid, a group of former heads of state. There is an initiative led by a former Korean prime minister called Leadership for Net Zero, how to achieve net zero through democratic principles and practices. So I'm meeting with them on Friday in Stockholm. I would love to have a further dialogue if that's of interest to you or your colleagues in the Swedish Parliament, because I think this is really fundamental, and the education of the general public and the communications. If we are indeed in a state of crisis, we also need to employ some more proactive crisis communication strategies, I think. Another thing we're doing at the Climate Governance Commission is a global comms outreach with a Dutch media and social media company, very successful company that wants to reach 1.5 billion people around the world with a very positive message, also as Peter was saying, about the solutions, about accelerating action. So that's also an ongoing project. We'll have a launch in the UK, in London in the autumn with the engagement of the British royal family. And secondly, the innovations, the innovative thinking. The Climate Governance Commission, for example, we have very concrete proposals for an international platform for distributed renewable energy to deal with energy poverty around the world. A suggestion for a very concrete for a global policy clearinghouse to indeed accelerate countries' sharing and innovation on national policy measures which are most effective, like, as Augusto was saying, a price on carbon. So these are very concrete proposals that I'm really willing to talk to any parliamentarians or others in governments about pushing these forward, because just also in terms of accelerating at the international level, it can take only one state, one nation, even a small nation. Marshall Islands had extraordinary effects on the Paris Agreement and its ambition. So Sweden can do a lot. Other countries, like-minded countries, can do a lot to push forward and to just propose to the international community some more innovative accelerator kind of ideas, which are also very exciting and also build positive energy. So those are my comments. Thank you so much, and I look forward to further discussions.
Thank you so much, and good luck with you on the meeting. Sylvia, you want to have a short response as well. I think when you're thinking about this international law and how to strengthen that, there are examples from the other side. You know, strong business agreements and trade agreements. There's overruling national laws in some senses, and very strong justice systems and courts and so on. So, what do you think there? Is it on the capitalist side too strong against the democracy side?
Well, I think that is just illustrates that when countries think that the common interest is important enough, such as for international trade, they are willing to create the institutional structures that can make sure that treaties stick. They know how to do it. So it's all about, is the political will strong enough, or are there, blockers? Because since every single nation can block these processes, that's a big problem. I just wanted my brief comment would only be tying back to what Maria was mentioning about changing the narrative, and to truly to change the perspective, to change the short-term thinking to long-term thinking, to expand the concern and representation from not only citizens to the common good. It takes a lot of leadership, as you mentioned, and a lot can be done with leadership, but we should also not underestimate what people can rise to with value-based leadership. And in one climate conference years ago, another speaker raised the example of how slavery was abolished in the Commonwealth in the UK, and how that was the effect of 30 years of painstaking lobbying by Quakers, by people committed to the spirit of human dignity, of human, we are one human family, we cannot treat other human beings like this. And obviously the financial sacrifices were enormous. Slavery was a very profitable approach to making business. So I think we should not stay away from appealing to the sacrifice. We know in times of war, people have been willing to sacrifice enormous things for their own country. And we should not pretend that we can do these transitions as fast as they need to without sacrificing things. And that we should be I think leaders need to be honest and to be appealing to this spirit of solidarity and of course care for that the sacrifice we do is not making other people suffer, but it is in a joint endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to give the opportunity to Maria. I think you're still somewhere in the space, in the air. There you are. You have also listened to the other panel. Do you have some comments or thoughts do you want to share?
Well, thank you. Thank you again. It's been fascinating. I have to say, I cannot think of a better way to kickstart this very important conference starting tomorrow in Stockholm. And I have to say that we do need, and I make Sylvia's words my own. We need to fix the narrative. We need to really improve the way we communicate. We define the problem. I think that there was a common, a shared idea among the panelists saying basically we need to stop thinking in silos. We have so many multilateral international agreements that are not working. And they're not working because not only that we need to improve the design of the institutions, but it is impossible to address water pollution without understanding what is happening with the increase in emissions, without understanding what is happening with the extinction crisis, the pollution altogether. Ecosystems and the earth system does not operate in silos. And there are many ideas out there. I was very pleased to hear this chains of responsibility proposal by Maja and the International the Governance Commission and other ideas. But the truth is, we need an umbrella, an overarching, coherent framework that puts emphasis on accountability, on compliance, because I think that we really need to recover the trust from citizens, especially from the younger generations. And I would really like to see revive the idea of a global pact for the environment, which has been mandated by the General Assembly. It was in the process of being negotiated in Nairobi, in UNEP, and unfortunately it ended up being a declaration. And I think that we do need a global pact for the environment that would basically embrace the development of environmental international law, but also this more holistic, interconnected concept of the earth system. And the basic question here is how we govern the commons. The only way to come together with greater cooperation and solidarity is to redefine the concept of national sovereignty and national interest. I think we cannot think of national interest if we all disappear as a species because of climate change. So national interest is about global interest. National sovereignty should be a shared sovereignty about our commons. So that's why sometimes we repeat deeds and not words. We're tired of words. We need action, but we cannot have action if we don't fix the words, the narrative, and the conceptual part. And I think one of the challenges is precise to reach an agreement of a revisited version of what sovereignty means, what shared sovereignty means as we face, the governing challenges of our commons. And if I may suggest something, I follow very closely what Augusto said about redefining security. And I strongly believe that the approach of human security serves very well the purpose that we're trying to address here. The concept of human security connected to environmental security. And of course, it's very difficult just to shift the narrative on that direction when we are experiencing a war and when we are listening from so many leaders, a very belligerent kind of discourse. But this is an existential need to really shift paradigms, shift narrative, and of course, shift the responses that the international community provides. And I'm also a strong believer of the power of we, as I said. the collective power we have as citizens, as consumers, as voters. I think that the power is on us. The most important office is not, with all the respect, the office of the president, of the prime minister, the office of the parliament, but the office of the citizen. I strongly believe that's where happen and transformation can happen. So sorry about a very long response, and back to you.
Thank you so much. And now let's see if there is anyone here that are physical here that want to comment or ask anything. Yeah, please start.
Here we go. Hello, everyone. This is Khalid Imam, a human rights lawyer from Egypt. Thank you so much. This was really amazing sessions. All these insights was very helpful. And I'm gonna cover the other part of Matthias' question about when the democracy does not exist, other country of the world, which is unfortunately many. So today we spoke about some proposal for the parliament, and I think the citizen was keyword everyone mentioned, how we need work on the ground, how we need to connect to citizens, not just certain governments or states. But also in many cases we have seen that agendas like climate change and environmental agenda and international cooperation and aid has been used a lot as a political tool to not support those citizens, to support certain regimes and governments that in most of the cases are military governments does not really have the capacity to work in climate change or to do something else. They are not trained on this. They know how to fight. So we have seen this a lot, and we have seen that a lot of grants and conferences, COPs happening in these countries, and it has been used as a huge propaganda to give power to these regimes, not to people. So my question to all of you, how we can ensure accountability, which also was mentioned by some of you, how we can ensure accountability at the international level within the UN and also states to make sure that resources going to people, not to certain regimes. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can also take you at the same time so they can respond.
There, okay. Thank you for your comments and for your introductions. Following the news, I sense a general political will around the world to address the environment question. I also follow a lot of scientific developments that I think are very proposing. The question I see is the challenge of changing infrastructure. How to get the scientific developments on a scalable level, and also to change the current infrastructure for energy and transportation. I'm curious to what the panel has to say about what they would like to see and what they see, what kind of developments are happening in changing infrastructure.
Thank you so much. Leaving the floor to the panel for both of the addressed questions.
Well, I think the first question is quite a dilemma because of this principle of national sovereignty. We as humanity or as an international community of state have not yet accepted structures that could enact accountability on members that behave not in line with accepted, human rights or other things. And that is the stage of evolution where we are. And we have to be aware of the limitations of the current system and really look at the foundations for that system and how we can organically evolve that to a system where that can come into place. And then about infrastructure, I do not follow that myself, but the one thing that is important is for governments to learn to think long term, right? It's about long-term decision making. I live in the Netherlands where governments have made enormous investments in very advanced infrastructure in response to environmental calamities in order to protect human security, you know, from storms, from sea level rise. They have mastered this, and yet they also struggle with, you know, the next set of infrastructure, more in terms of how do we, as a low-level country, how much do we invest now to protect ourselves from future sea level rise? But it puts a lot of the trade-offs between short-term and long-term to the edge, right? Cannot really say much more than that.
Just a couple of sort of supplementary comments to what Sylvia added. It seems to me that democracy itself, of course, has its own accountability mechanism embedded in it, right? If you talk especially about mature democracies, if they don't deliver the public goods that the voters expect, then the politicians will be held accountable and they will be voted out of office. And there is a certain kind of justice in that. Unfortunately, we live in a world in which some of the largest emitters of carbon dioxide and related gases are not democracies themselves, right? However, even in those cases, there is a kind of accountability which is kind of a more longer term, right? The Soviet Union collapsed to a large extent because it was not able to deliver to its constituents, to its population, you know, some of the most elementary basic things, you know, like food and sort of a clean environment and so on. And you know, it fell under the weight of its own failures. Right? On the second question, I think that the debate is basically how do we finance this transition to a renewable energy economy? We have to do massive investments over the next decade or so, and I think that what frustrates me a little bit sometimes is the kind of a lack of imagination to think about ways in which we could raise the funds. You know, we're not ambitious enough. You know, Sweden and Switzerland, as far as I know, as of about a year ago, which is how old the data is in my head, were the only two countries in the world that had a carbon tax that was high enough to be consistent with what we need to do globally in order to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees. Right? According to the IMF, we should be talking about a carbon tax of something like $70 to $100 per ton, and I think the world average is $2 per ton. Right? So the gap is huge, and there is a certain kind of unwillingness, you know, to sort of look at other potential sources of revenue to finance that transition. Here again, you know, the issue of political leadership is very important. And unfortunately, vested interests very often step in. The issue of, for instance, a tax on financial transactions has been debated on and on for years and years and years. And the consensus is moving in the direction of you know, coming up with something like this, because the potential revenue associated with that is huge, because the financial sector has grown in its scale over the last 30, 40 years in a big way. But we're not there yet. My hope is that if we were to move in that direction, we could release potentially very important resources to fund this transition.
Thank you. Now I will give Dan opportunity to have your closing words and your final thoughts, and then also Peter, if you want to have some comments, and then we're about to.
Thank you. So these have been excellent questions. I'm going to try to put all of them into a larger framework, perhaps, and offer maybe a dissatisfying and hopefully a somewhat satisfying answer to your question, which I think opens the door to all the other ones we've been discussing. So the first thing I would say is that our model of change is founded on a posture of adversarialism, whether it's democracy, which pits different parties against each other, or civil society against an unwanted leader. It's very adversarial. Even the women's movement, of which I'm hopefully one of its greatest advocates, I tried to be, is founded on principles of adversarialism. You protest in the streets, you sort of demand and expect that you get something in return. And that has created some excellent change. And I don't want to discount the change that has come from that. But it's hard to build a global society on principles that pit people against each other. It's like a foundation that is broken, and then you try to build an edifice on it, it's bound to collapse. So all of these solutions are temporary. Now, that doesn't mean we give up. We throw up our hands and say, you know, it's impossible to do anything. The question, though, is how do we get to that new space from where we are? And I'm reminded of the G20 a couple of years ago that took place in Saudi Arabia. And there was a debate about whether civil society should participate or not. I was very much on the side of participating. Yes, there are issues of human rights in that country as in any other. However, if the doors open a crack, that's an opportunity to put a wedge in, build some relationships, demonstrate your good willingness to do right by the people, and hopefully that door opens more and more. That way it's a non-adversarial approach. And of course, I'm not trying to say that every country will do this and every opportunity should be there, but it's a different way of thinking. Is my approach to change sustainable in the long term, or is it another form of adversity that will, you know, reinforce this conflict? Your turn, my turn, your turn, and then it ends up being that no progress occurs. You can look at polarization all over the world. In terms of spending, I'm thinking about ways that we motivate a population to do something that seems counter to their interests, like raising money to rebuild roads or any kind of infrastructure. And this has been done many times. You see it, you know, when the roads were built in the United States in the 50s, there was a really great influx of money, as Augusto and others have been saying. We have these resources. We just don't somehow have the willpower to raise them. And I think about what states do to raise that willpower, and then what people do as well. So I'm thinking about, you know, the amount of money that was spent on COVID-19. All justifiable. It was trillions of dollars, whereas the amount that's needed to counteract climate change is in the billions. That's orders of magnitude different. We have seatbelts, the fact that we fasten seatbelts. It's all preventative measures. We have the Montreal Protocol, the Blood Diamonds treaties. All of these things have taken place. Even stoplights are a form of impinging on your sovereignty. You can't go through the traffic light. You're willing to stop because you know there's a greater good that comes from it. And then finally, my favorite one is this, I don't know if you've heard this song from Australia, it's called Dumb Ways to Die. And it's about how to protect yourself on the subway. And it's this hilarious tune with all kinds of diagrams. And you just think this sticks in your head and it's funny. And you actually smile when you think about the subway coming because you don't want to be a victim of a dumb way to die, which is, you know, on the subway platform. The states have so many opportunities to do this, as do we. Anybody could have made that song and, you know, gotten the tune stuck in Dan's head 5 years later, and it has an effect on behavior. And I think we have to use this power of narrative in order to push ourselves and our governments to do what's right. And that can happen in a spirit of mutualism, not merely in a spirit of adversarialism.
Thank you. And now, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I also think, I don't know if you have come across this concept of an ever-advancing civilization, where you look at ourselves that there are individuals, there is communities, and there is institutions. So if we were, you know, to take a quick review, the capacity of the institutions is really advancing at a very fast pace. And you look at also the capacity of, you know, coming up with all these agreements and very elaborate, you know, documents and detailed in different ways. It's quite deep. You look at the capacity of communities, it is also growing, but it is not matching, you know, the capacity of the institutions. If you go down to the individual, we're still, you know, way far behind. You know, if you ask individuals in terms of certain questions of, you know, the degradation of the environment, or, you know, even the three crises, you know, the planet is facing today. So if we were to really bring things up to speed, we start to harness also on the capacity of the individual. That would also, we bring them together, you realize the capacity of the community is even stronger. And that gives itself to a more informed or a more capable institutions. You talk of parliament, are members of parliament who comes from communities, that communities have matured enough to say, let's have Mr. Anders or Matthias represent us in parliament. But also, you flip the side of the coin. When members of parliament come together, sometimes they forget that they have come from that system, they have come from that community that wants them to be accountable, not on political alignment or manifestos, but truly to live up to what they stand as individuals. They know that sometimes there are measures that are against the environment, but because they want to align with a political framework or a party manifesto, so they sometimes have to protect their interests. But if they lived beyond to see that there is a community or there are individuals and the community that gave birth to them to become institutions as members of parliament, then you would see that that line or that marriage of the individual, the communities, and the capable institutions will really help to fast track this and to keep growing, to keep realigning and reflecting and rethinking on what we have to do. Because it's already, the stage is already set. There is nothing else we have to. We just have to, to play the orchestra with all the tools that we have, and the capacity is there. It's not that we don't have the capacity. The finance is there. How do parliamentarians, for example, channel not all the resources, but put more resources to environmental agenda, put more resources to empower the youth and the academia, the research, to keep advancing this conversation, and not to amass wealth or resources to war, to protect, for example, the conversation on we want to have to buy fuel at affordable prices. But how is it possible then we can't say we want to invest more? Say, for example, if I use a practical example for the government of India is really pushing on the renewables. And you could see practical examples coming out of India that are really remarkable. But this is also the challenge to all of us, and especially to the members of parliament, to keep reframing and rethinking how do we keep this enough resources and it creates enough spaces to reflect about the environmental agenda, not only when invited to UN meetings, but also in parliament, houses in different parts of the world, to keep this agenda live and to really make it happen.
Thank you so much. And now we will have a break with some refreshments, and we're going to be here back in 49 minutes. And the one that can't make it to be here in 49 minutes, you're also free to leave. And if you want to leave, then you take, you do a U-turn, and then you take the white door, another door, and then another door. And if a guard tell you something, then you are wrong. But if you're out in the space, you did right. Yes, it's better to come back. Yeah, and we also want to thank the panel with a great applause.